Perfecto. Bueno, vamos a dar comienzo. Primero que nada, muchísimas gracias
So let's
por
start. First
participar.
of all, thank
Mi
you
nombre es
so
Sol
much
Nottage,
for
soy
being part of
miembro
this
de
webinar. My
Control
name is
Arms,
Sol Nottage, and
del
I'm the
monitor
member
de
of
Control
Control
Arms,
Arms,
y
of the
les quiero
monitor
dar
of
la
Control Arms.
bienvenida a
And I would
nuestros
like to
oradores de hoy,
welcome
Kim
our speakers
Lamberty,
for today's
Pablo,
webinar,
Arrocha,
Kim Lamberty, Pablo
Olabuenaga y
Arrocha,
María
Olabuenaga,
Devoto,
and
que
María
nos van a estar
Devoto.
acompañando.
And they're going
Este
to be with
evento
us in this
está
webinar. This
realizado
webinar
en
is being
colaboración
organized
entre
together with
Control Arms,
Control
Asociación
Arms,
para las Políticas
Association
Públicas y
for
Forum
Public Policies,
of the Arms
Asociación para
Trade.
las Políticas
Bueno,
Públicas,
so
and Forum
first of
on
all,
the Arms
nuestra
Trade. We have our
panelista de hoy
speaker,
es
María
María Pia
Devoto.
Devoto. María
She
Pia
is a
Devoto es
director
directora de
of
la Asociación para
Asociación
las
para las
Políticas
Políticas
Públicas,
Públicas.
es
She is
especialista
specialist
en
in
temas de seguridad
international security
internacional y
and
no
non-proliferation,
proliferación,
disarm,
desarme, control
arms
de armas
control,
y
and
género.
gender, and she carries
Realiza
out
actividades de
advocacy activities,
incidencia,
analysis, and she
análisis
is
y
an
es
active
un miembro
member of
activo
several
de varias
networks of
redes
civil
de la sociedad
society.
civil.
And
Es
also,
miembro
María
fundadora de
Pia,
la Red Argentina para el Desarme,
she
de
is
la
the
Red de
founding member
Seguridad
of
Humana de
the
Latinoamérica y el
Argentina
Caribe,
Network for
CELAC.
Disarmament for the Latin
Bueno,
America, CELAC.
Pablo es un diplomático mexicano con 20
So
años de
Pablo,
experiencia.
he
Actualmente
is
es
a
consejero
Mexican
jurídico
diplomat
de la
with 20 years
Secretaría
of
de Relaciones
experience,
Exteriores
and
de
currently he
México.
is a legal advisor
Anteriormente
at the
fue asesor
Ministry of Foreign
jurídico de la
Affairs of
Misión
Mexico.
Permanente de México
Before,
ante
he
las
was a
Naciones
legal
Unidas en Nueva
advisor
York,
of the permanent
donde
mission
representó a
of
su
the
país
UN
en el
in New
Consejo
York,
de Seguridad
where
y la
he
Asamblea General.
represented Mexico
También
in the Security Council and
prestado
the
sus
General
servicios en
Assembly.
la Subsecretaría de
He
Asuntos
has also
Multilaterales y
provided
Derechos
services at
Humanos
the
de la
Undersecretariat
Secretaría de
in
Relaciones Exteriores
Multilateral
de
Affairs
México
and Human
y en
Rights
la
at
sección
the
consular de la
Ministry of Foreign
Embajada de
Affairs of
México en
Mexico and
Washington,
in the
D.C.
consular section
Es
of the Embassy
afiliado
of
al
Mexico
Programa
in
de Derecho
Washington, D.C. He is
Internacional y
affiliated of the
Conflictos
Program
Armados
of
de la Facultad de
International
Derecho de
Law and
Harvard
Armed Conflict at the School
y
of Law in
miembro
Harvard,
del Consejo
and
Editorial
he
del
is the
Anuario
member of
Mexicano de
the
Derecho Internacional.
editing
Es
council of the
licenciado en Derecho por
International
la
Law Annuary.
Universidad
He
Nacional
has a
Autónoma de
degree of law
México
by the
y tiene un máster en
UNAM,
Derecho
and he
Internacional
has a master's
Público
degree
por
in
el
international law
University College
by the
de
University
Londres.
College
Es
of
antiguo
London.
alumno de la Academia de Derecho
He is
Internacional de La
a
Haya, del
former
Instituto
student of the Age
Universitario
Academy
Europeo
at
y del
the
Instituto
European
Internacional de San Remo.
Institute and the
Y por
San Rem
último,
Institute.
Kim
And
Lamberty
lastly, we have Kim
es
Lamberty.
directora
She is the
ejecutiva
executive
del
director
Quixote Center, no sé si lo pronuncié bien,
at the
donde
Quixote
lidera
Center.
el
And I don't know if
desarrollo
I
de
pronounced
programas
this
en Haití y
correctly.
América Central,
And she
así
leads the
como la
development
incidencia en
of
Estados
programs in
Unidos en
Haiti and
torno
Central
a
America,
políticas
and as well
exteriores y
advocacy in the
migratorias.
U.S.
Desde la
in
década de
relation to
1990 trabaja en
foreign
alianza con
policies and
comunidades de
migration
pequeños
policies.
agricultores en
Since
Haití,
the 90s, he
abordando
works
las
together
causas
with the small
estructurales de la
farmers in
pobreza y de la
Haiti
violencia.
and being
Además,
part
es fundadora y
addressing the
presidenta de
structural
Just
causes of poverty
Haití,
and violence.
una
She
empresa
is
de
the founder
comercio
and
justo
president of
de
Just
café que
IT,
promueve la
a
justicia económica
fair
para
trade
agricultores
company of
pequeños
coffee
y
providing
vulnerables.
economic justice for
Eh,
small farmers and vulnerable
Además, Kim
farmers.
organizó un evento del que
And
se
Kim
hablará sobre
organized an
transferencias
event,
de armas en
and we're going to be
Haití el
talking about the
24 de
transfer
abril.
of arms in Haiti on April
Luego les
24.
vamos a enviar
And
más
later on,
información
we're
sobre el
going
evento.
to share more
Bueno,
information about
esas
this
son las
event.
presentaciones
So
y
those
María
are
Pía,
our
te doy pie
speakers. And
para
Maria
hablar.
Pia, you have now the floor.
Muchísimas gracias, Sol. Bueno, buenos días, buenas tardes, de acuerdo a donde estén. Muchas gracias también
Thank
a
you so
Control
much,
Arms
Sol. Good
por la
morning,
iniciativa de
everyone,
este
or good
evento y por la
evening.
invitación a
Thank you
colaborar
so
junto con
much
el
to
Foro on
Control
Arms
Arms
Trade.
for this initiative
Y
of
en esta
this
ocasión
event
vamos
and
a
for
hablar
the
del tema del
invitation
control
to
de
work
armas y
together with
derechos
the Forum
humanos,
on
¿no?
the
En
Arms
América
Trade.
Latina y cómo se integra el tratado
We're
de
going to be
comercio de
talking
armas y
about
otros
control
instrumentos, ¿no?
arms
Y otros
and human
mecanismos,
rights
pero
in
debemos
Latin America and
diferenciar
how the
las
treaty,
armas que están sujetas al control del tratado,
how the
por
Arms
un
Trade
lado,
Treaty is
tenemos que
embedded, and we're going to be
diferenciar el
talking about some
tráfico,
other
el
mechanisms,
contrabando
but
y
the
el
arms that
desvío,
are
que lo vamos
subject
a
to the
considerar
control
como
of the
lo que
treaty on the
sucede
one
al
hand,
interno
we
de
have to
un país. Yo lo que
differentiate
voy a hacer
the
es
traffic
simplemente
from
dar
smuggling
un
and
poco de
deviation, which
contexto
is what
para dar
happens
el pie
within a
a los
country.
dos,
So
a los
what
dos
I would like
panelistas, ¿no?
to
Hay
do
algunos
is
aspectos
just
que
to
ya
give
son
you the
súper
overview, the
conocidos para
context,
todos los
so
que
we could
estamos
give the
trabajando en estos
floor to
temas,
our
sabemos
other
que
two
América Latina y
speakers.
el Caribe
And there
tiene el
are some
20%
aspects
de
that
la
are
población mundial y
well
representan
known for
un
everyone
tercio
that
de los
address these
homicidios
topics,
a
the fact that
nivel,
Latin America and the Caribbean
global, que
has
muestra
this
como una
population and
desproporción, ¿no?
represents
Porque
a
sería como
third
el
of these killings globally, showing a lack of proportion, because that would be the double of the world average and 10 times more than some other countries in Europe and Asia. And these killings, in relation to arms, it is a strong relation. It has an importance. We have a 60% in South America, 70% in Central America, and in 61% in the Caribbean, when the average is 42%. And in particular, by region, it is not always the product of transfer. When we talk about the armed violence, it is the result. We could say that armed violence is the result of arms manufactured in the same country, which is not the case of Latin America and Central America, which is due to imports. There are some countries of the region experiencing this violence with these um, uh, homemade arms, but as we know, arms are manufactured illegally, and in a certain moment they are deviated to the illicit traffic. And this has a very important impact and one of the great challenges of the region, which is the organized crime. And this deviation, I think that that's exactly what we know in the treaty. And if you have the possibility to reach out to this armed trade treaty, it has a specific article, which is Article 12. Article 11, what it says, the wording of this is related to Latin America and the Caribbean. So this type of language and the promotion to have that specific article in the treaty comes from Latin America. And another characteristic of a treaty in the region is universality. We have 116 member states, and 32 or 33% of the member states are from Latin America and the Caribbean. And the last one was Colombia. We have a treaty, yes, we have instruments, we have CIFTA, the Inter-American Convention, we have mechanisms, we have roadmaps promoting this, and we have one recent a collaboration between a lyric and the OAS to fight illicit traffic. But in all of those cases, and I think that it is the same thing in our region, there's a huge difference between the treaties that we may have and the distance that happens when implementing them. One of the things that we're experiencing in the region and in the last years, as we're talking about human rights, is the setback that we're experiencing in the region in terms of respect of human rights. There is a global index of the rule of law, which is World Justice Project, saying that there is an increase of authoritarianism, there is a restriction of the rights, and of course, together with a lack of efficiency in terms of justice. Among the countries with the lowest indexes, we see Venezuela and Haiti. And in Haiti, well, we're going to be listening from one of our speakers about this, but we're going to be talking about insecurity, violence, and crime. And then we also have Nicaragua, one of the lowest indexes where we don't have a lot of information. We have El Salvador, which is so popular in terms of all of the measures that have been implemented there, and Ecuador, which is now positioning today as the most violent country of Latin America in relation to inside crime. So consequences, and by talking to our colleagues, that is just vendates just due to the control of territory, crime, and organized crimes, which is G2. And those are the ones having access to arms, but they charge monthly and a monthly fee to provide security to companies. In the case of Venezuela, for a long time ago, the situation in terms of human rights have been worsening, but it was worsened in the last election period and after the elections. We have also these military groups from Bolivia, these Bolivian military groups defending this the land. If we see that we have these the collectives, which are some choke bands, paramilitary groups created by Hugo Chavez during the Chavism, which they were concentrating in Caracas, in Barrio 23, the operation of the security forces that were the Tuntun operation in 2016-17, and then they had it in 2004 for disappearances, arbitrary detentions, thousands of political prisoners, and a total impunity of justice. Now, in relation to those cases, there are some reactions within this. In the case of Venezuela, where we was engaged in the International Criminal Court, the High Commissioner of Human Rights for Human Rights. There is a complaint of an Argentinian judge to Nicolás Maduro and Deolado Cabello, and a group for this principle of legal universality to talk about the crimes of lesa humanity. But if we stop for a second and if we talk about Venezuela, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Haiti, they are not member states of this arms trade treaty. This doesn't mean that they are part of some other instruments. And those instruments which are part and they have controls, they could also be used as a framework, or some instances we're going to be listening later as how the Inter-American Court of Human Rights does it. And a recent news that I think that came, probably you could talk about this more, which is happened last week. I think that in a port in Haiti, there was a decommissioning of arms in some boxes and containers, and they were having food and clothes or something like that coming from Florida. And this is a constant thing, that these smuggling arms coming from the U.S. And that's also the case of Mexico, that probably Pablo is going to talk about this. So I thought that it was important for us to understand the consequences of having a great producer or manufacturer of arms in the region, and for us to be the backyard. And what is the meaning of this? As for Mexico and the case of Haiti, that's what I would like to ask our speakers. What is your perspective in terms of risks, challenges, and the problems that may cause the flow of arms? So that's it. Thank you so much. And I would like to give the floor, I don't know, Pablo, Kim, who would like to start first with your presentation. So we're looking forward to listening to you. Kim, please go ahead. Because, well, Pablo says you go first.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to speak in English. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak. And I want to share a couple things. First, that I've been working in Haiti since the 90s. And as the introduction said, my organizations work primarily with smallholder farmers for economic development, improving household income, and sustainability over the long term. Quixote Center started working on the arms trafficking issue because our partners in Haiti told us that was their priority, that it was the most important thing for them to stop the flow of arms from the United States into Haiti, because it's destroying their country, making democracy impossible, and also making it extremely difficult their economic development work. So that's how we became involved in the arms trafficking issue, and some will be information that comes directly from our partners in Haiti. I also want to say, a lot of times when people talk about Haiti, you start out with how awful things are. And I'm going to say some horrific things, because things are horrific. But I also want to say Haiti is a beautiful, resilient country. People are continuing with their lives. They're continuing with the work to build up their farms and their countryside. There's significant mutual aid going on as best people can under the circumstances. And the Haitian people will survive this. So I want to just emphasize that before talking about the fact that almost 90% of the capital, Port-au-Prince, is currently controlled by gangs. People are afraid that it's going to fall essentially completely in the coming weeks. Last year, over 5,600 people were killed by gang violence, countless numbers of kidnappings, and the massacres are continuing all over the country, not just in Port-au-Prince, but they've moved up into the north area where we have partners. And the community that we work with up in the north has been victim of gang violence multiple times at this point. Over 1 million people are displaced, primarily out of Port-au-Prince, because they're fleeing the violence there. And so where do they go, right? They go to the countryside. So the countryside is under enormous pressure dealing with internally displaced people, half of whom are children. And they are also dealing with deportees from the Dominican Republic and the United States, on top of dealing with gang violence. We've also got a severe food shortage. They're saying half the country at this point can't feed itself. Partly that's because Port-au-Prince is under siege, and some of the food that was imported came out of Port-au-Prince, but also the gangs control the roads, and so people can't get to places to purchase food if they're not growing it themselves. So half the country is facing severe hunger. They're saying approximately 8,000 people are facing actual starvation. Those people are generally in tent camps in the city for displaced people. They estimate that half of gang recruits are children. That's one of the biggest problems in the country, because if you've got that many displaced children, which is what we have, and they're not in school, and they're trying to figure out how you're going to resolve the life of your family, joining a gang is an option. And so that's what's happening. There's also extreme instances of sexual violence. People who are kidnapped by gangs report very violent sexual attacks, and people who are in internally displacement camps are also victims of sexual violence. There is very little access to medical care. The judicial system is practically non-functional. The government is practically non-functional. And the gangs have also attacked hospitals, both in Port-au-Prince and most recently the flagship hospital up in Mirabelais in the north was attacked. So that is the situation in Haiti, and it's bleak, right? It's bleaker than any of us can remember, and I've been working there since the 90s, as I said before. The primary cause, what fuels this violence, what enables it, what makes it possible, is arms trafficking illegally from the United States. They do not manufacture weapons or ammunition in Haiti. It all comes from the outside. It would not be possible to perpetrate this level of violence against the country without the weapons that are coming in from the US. And they're bringing in high caliber weapons that can blow up airplanes and pierce armor that they can actually buy in the United States legally, usually through straw purchasers, and then illegally traffic it into Haiti. It's good to keep in mind that there is a UN embargo against selling weapons to Haiti, which the trafficking is in violation of, and the United States has failed to stop it. So it's lax gun laws in the US. It's also lax enforcement of the ports and also corruption. So it's literally hundreds of thousands of guns, along with the ammunition that goes with it. And, we would say, our partners in Haiti say, actually cut off the ammunition, because if you cut off the ammunition, the guns are useless. Just cut off the ammunition. Studies, the estimate is it's 70 to 90% are originating from the US. Most exit through Florida, primarily the Miami River port, also some out of Fort Lauderdale. The Miami River port is extremely chaotic. So there are container after container after container, and it's clothes, and shoes, and people shipping stuff into Haiti. And in among all those containers are weapons and ammunition. And what we've heard from the Department of Homeland Security is that it's very hard to inspect that port, and we think that's not credible. We know that when the Department of Homeland Security in the US wants to put resources into something, they make it happen, and they're not putting resources into this, clearly, because weapons are getting out through Miami River. Some exit out of the US and go into third countries first, such as Jamaica or the Dominican Republic, and then they enter Haiti that way. In particular, Dominican Republic has pretty porous borders and, lack enforcement there as well. They've recently said they're going to improve enforcement around migration. That doesn't help with respect to weapons trafficking. And the problem is there's significant commerce, cross-border commerce between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So you don't want the borders closed. That makes things worse. But you do want enforcement of weapons trafficking. So what we would say is that this is a failure on the part of the United States that is fixable. And we've heard all sorts of remedies proposed: send troops, send, Navy SEALs, send more Kenyans to support the UN mission. And we would say that stop the flow of weapons and you stop the violence. So I'll end there, and I'm glad to take any questions about Haiti when it's time for questions.
Muchas gracias, Kim,
Thank you very much, Kim. Thank you for showing us that landscape. We'll talk a bit more about what are the possibilities that are out there, what can be done. We'll do that in the next round. Now, speaking about the challenges and the flow of weapons, we'd like to hear about the case for Mexico.
María, Sol y Kim por la invitación. Me da mucho gusto ver caras conocidas. Veo también entre los participantes muchos nombres de
Thank you very
buenos
much,
amigos a lo largo de
Pia,
los
Sol,
años.
and Kim. It's a pleasure. I'm happy to see familiar faces here. Also, in the participants, among the participants, a lot of friends with whom we've negotiated the arms trade treaty, carrying out those struggles in different spaces, bringing in that necessary language which you were mentioning. I think it's the first time that I've called you Pia instead of Maria. But we did that for the agreement, and it was a great process bringing forward the ATT, working with the General Assembly. At that time, it was also signed by the United States. That was a promising sign, an index of the times. There was more control around for weapons at that time. And everything that's happening with Trump, this country is no longer a signatory. They expressed their interest to be off of that. It's also important for me to clarify that the ATT, what it sought to do from the very beginning was to control the illicit flow of weapons. And that's fundamental here because at the time when we were negotiating the treaty, there was more control, more regulation for the flow of bananas than there were for weapons at an international level. And before we focus on the illicit flow and the diversion of this market, let's be very clear about the panorama here, the illicit flow of weapons, who's involved, who's participating, so that we can then have a deep look of how that relates to the legal market. The ATT is not restrictive when it comes to national sales, internal sales of weapons. That's to say, it's not regulating the exchange of weapons inside the country. It's not an invasive policy in that terms. It hasn't impacted the United States, for example. For Mexico, this is very different. It's a horrible situation, and what is a huge challenge here is organized crime. And organized crime cannot operate without these weapons that are coming in illegally from the United States. And when we're talking about this, we have to repeat the figures once and once again because they're terrible. Annually, between 200 to 500,000 weapons coming into the country illegally. It's a huge amount of weapons that are coming in illegally into Mexico. And this has been happening now for some years. We're talking about decades. So the volume in question here that already in Mexico that should never have been here is astounding. We can contrast that to another figure. In Mexico, due to our policies, we have one point of sale for weapons so that the Mexican population can purchase weapons through the Secretary of National Defense. There's just one point of sale, while in the United States, there's more than 75,000 stores for purchasing weapons, and the majority of these are on the Mexican border. And that is no surprise. It has to do with analyzing the market. It's an example of actors who have studied the market. We also, when it comes to small-scale vendors, that's what's happening at the border. At the border, that's what we have. These are small-scale sales where you have no regulation of the sales. And this is not unknown to the different authorities, including in the United States, and that's why so many weapons are then captured and recommissioned in the United States, or excuse me, in Mexico. And we know this because of Mexican entities that capture the weapons, and everything leads to the United States, and this is very clear here. The cities that have the most number of weapons sold to Mexico are Houston, Phoenix, El Paso, and San Antonio. All of these are border cities, and these are also cities that have a culture for weapons. There's a strong passion for owning weapons, and there's also small amount of regulation there. And then here also is relevant the importance of being able to trace weapons and also ammunition. One of the hardest things that was able to get into the treaty was the ammunition. We were able to talk about getting weapons restrictions in there and tracing them, but with ammunition, it was very difficult. I also want to add another piece of information that gives us a sense of the problem, and then also make a comment about the importance of changing narratives. The first thing is we are working with a report that came out of the ATF. This is the main office in the United States that controls and regulates weapons. 64% of the illegal flow of weapons coming from the United States ended up in Mexico. So that means that 70 to 90% of illegal weapons that come into Mexico are coming from the United States. It also means that 26%, the other 26% is mainly distributed in this region. So not Mexico, but the Caribbean, like Haiti and Central America, but mostly the Caribbean. That's why it's so important for Mexico to not only combat this phenomenon and to do it directly and based on rights. In the second part of this conference, I'll talk about Mexico's strategic efforts to do this, like litigation in the United States and cases with the Inter-American Court. But I want to bring up three important points. The first is that this is an issue of life or death in Mexico. Mexico has the bodies. That's where the deaths occur. And so we're not talking about a political campaign theme here or a slogan. This is not some kind of soundbite that benefits some politician. Mexico really is experiencing a measurable and tangible crisis that we have to confront. And we have to lead this
El segundo
effort.
elemento es que también, como sabemos que muchas naciones hermanas
The
padecen de
second
lo mismo,
point
pues en
is
gran
that
medida muchas
many
miran
of
México
our
como un punto de
neighboring
referencia
countries
de
are
qué es lo que hay que
experiencing the
hacer y
same
de
thing,
un primer
and many
foco de
times
control.
they look at
Y de
Mexico
hecho,
as
por
a point
eso
of
hemos
reference to
recibido muchos
understand what they should
apoyos,
do in
inclusive en
terms of
ocasiones como
regulation.
amicus curiae
And
para algunos
so
procesos,
we've received
de
a
lo
lot
que
of
México ha
support,
iniciado con
particularly
países que precisamente son
including
de la
amicus
región y sur del
curiae
Caribe, porque
statements
padecemos de lo
from
mismo
countries in the region,
en
particularly the
medidas y
Caribbean, because we're
proporciones diferentes,
experiencing the
pero
same crisis.
básicamente el
Sometimes the
foco del
numbers are
problema está
different,
claramente
but
identificado para el
basically
resto de la
the
región.
point is
Y el
this,
tercero
the
es
central
que,
problem is the
más allá de
same.
los temas de colaboración y
And
cooperación
then
desde
the
una
third
perspectiva de
point
seguridad
is that
internacional y
beyond
en temas bilaterales,
collaboration and
que como saben la presidenta
cooperation
Claudia
at the
Sheinbaum
national
lo ha
and
planteado en sus
bilateral
conversaciones con el
level,
presidente
as
Donald
President
Trump,
Sheinbaum has
más allá de eso,
mentioned
lo
in
que
her
también nos parece muy
interactions
importante es
with
poder
Donald Trump,
poco a poco ir
what is
modificando la
important
narrativa, sobre
is to be
todo
able
con
to
la ciudadanía
change bit by bit
estadounidense, para que
the narrative
entiendan
that
y
is
sepan que no se
consumed
trata de un
by the
ataque de
US
México
audience,
a
the
su
US public,
derecho a
so that
poseer
they
armas
understand that
y un
this
ataque a la
is
segunda
not an
enmienda de Estados
effort
Unidos, que
to
eso es lo que activa
go
una
against
reacción
the
muy
Second
visceral de
Amendment
no
and
se
their
metan
right to
con el
bear
derecho a
arms.
poseer armas y
We
no se metan
understand that
con
people
mi
there
constitución.
don't want
No,
that.
no se
No
trata de
one
eso.
wants
Si las
foreign
200 a 500
powers
mil armas que se
meddling with
produjeron
the
en Estados Unidos
Constitution and those
se quedaran
rights.
en Estados Unidos cada año,
But if all
perfecto,
of these
o sea, que
weapons that were being
siga
produced in the
vigente la
United
segunda
States
enmienda y que
were to
las
stay
sean
in the United
ellos.
States, well, then
El
that's great.
problema no es
Have
ese,
your
el problema
weapons.
es que la
But that's not
negligencia
the
y el
problem.
abuso
The
de
problem
esa
is the
permisividad
negligence and the
termina
abuse
afectando
of
a la
these
ciudadanía
rights
mexicana.
then impacts the
Y
Mexican
lo que
population.
queremos es transmitir esa
And
parte, que
that's
no
the
se
message
trata de
that
una
we want to
queja
get across.
política necesariamente de apuntarnos dedos a ver quién es responsable de qué.
That
Al final del
this
día, los
isn't a policy
círculos
about
o
pointing
los círculos de
fingers and
violencia
casting
y de
blame,
fenómenos
but
delictivos
ultimately about
involucran a
violence
varios
and
estados.
cycles of
También
violence
sabemos que
that
esto
involve
forma parte de un
multiple
contexto más
countries.
amplio
And we also
de
know that
narcóticos,
this
de
is
lucha
also
contra el
connected to
narcotráfico, de dónde están
narco
las cadenas de
trafficking,
producción, también tomando en cuenta que el principal mercado de
also to
consumo es
supply chains,
Estados Unidos,
and
pero por eso
understanding
tiene
that
que haber
a
colaboración,
lot of the
pero a un
consumption
nivel
happens in the United
de la
States.
población y de la ciudadanía. Lo que esperamos es que pueda haber más
But
empatía para
on the part
entender
of the
que
citizens and
México
the
no quiere que el
population, we're hoping to have
estadounidense
more
no pueda ir a comprar
empathy
armas.
and for
Lo
them
que
to
quiere es
understand
que
that
todas las armas que
Mexico does
compra el
not want to
estadounidense no
intervene
terminen en
in their
México.
right to purchase
Es así
weapons.
de sencillo. ¿Y
Mexico
por qué?
wants to
Porque
help
nuestra
Mexico.
población, al igual que
It's as
su
simple as
población,
that.
es la que termina
And why is
sufriendo,
this?
es la que
It's
termina
because it's our
perdiendo vidas, es
population,
la
just
que
like
termina con familias
populations in the
rotas.
United States that suffer the
Es
consequences.
donde
There
el
are
daño
broken
termina
families.
causándose.
This is where we see
Entonces,
the harms.
es a partir de eso que México ha tomado una decisión
And so that
de
is why
dar un paso
Mexico
hacia
has
adelante
taken this
desde el año
decision to move forward
2021 y
with
luego en
this since
2022,
2021,
que
also in
eso creo que lo
2022.
platicaremos después con
And we'll talk
litigios. Y
about
veo
that
también que entre los
subsequently when we
participantes
focus
está
on litigation.
Jonathan Lowy, que es uno
I
de los
also
abogados en
see
estas
that
casas,
Jonathan
entonces
Lowy
también
is
estará
here. He's one of the
poniendo mucha
attorneys.
atención y fiscalizando que
And
todo lo
so
que diga
we'll be
sea
paying attention
correcto.
to that and making sure that everything he says is correct.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Pablo. Bueno, y Kim también. Creo que
Thank you
sus
very much, Pablo and
exposiciones
Kim.
todo nos
I
lleva
think
a Estados
your
Unidos
presentations all point to the United
y
States
no al Tratado de Comercio de Armas,
and don't
sino
actually point
cuáles son los
to
mecanismos,
the
cuáles
problems
serían
with
las
the
posibles
ATT,
soluciones.
but
Y no
rather
es
with other
solamente
problems and
una
thus other
falta de
solutions.
control
It has to
en
do
el
with
puerto de
what's happening
Miami,
at the ports in
en el puerto de
Miami,
Fort
at the
Lauderdale,
ports in Fort Lauderdale,
no sé, en
in
Nueva
New
York,
York,
en la
at
frontera,
the
en la
border, at the
frontera con
Mexican
México.
border.
Entonces, ¿cuál es? Porque aparte del tema,
Because
el tema de la
beyond
frontera
the
con
issue of the
México,
Mexican
al mirar
border,
hacia abajo,
there's
hacia
also further
Guatemala y
south
Belice,
Guatemala
no
and other
solamente
countries.
el problema
So
es
it's not
para
just a
México,
problem for
sino
Mexico,
también que
it's a problem
impacta
that
en
impacts
los
the
países de la
entire
región.
region.
¿Cuáles son
And so,
que
what do
creen
you
que
believe
deberían ser
are the
las soluciones
solutions
para
that
detener
we have
este flujo?
to control this flow?
Kim, por favor.
Please go ahead, Kim.
So we've focused, thank you very much for the opportunity again to talk about Haiti and what the solutions are. We have focused on trying to convince the US government to make some changes. We have not been successful in those attempts, but I will summarize what we have tried to do and what we will continue to try to do. And then talk about some future steps that we're also looking at. So first of all, there are things that the U.S. administration could do if it wanted to. It could increase enforcement at Miami River. And we have, along with our allies in Congress and constituents, pressured the U.S. government to do that, both under the last administration and under the current administration. So increase enforcement at Miami River, increase the number of firearms recovered in Haiti that are submitted for tracing so that we can identify the origin of those weapons and hold the dealers accountable. ATF, which was mentioned by Pablo, has a program that requires notification for multiple sales of semi-automatic weapons to the same customer. It does not include Florida. Florida is where nearly all the weapons going to Haiti are coming from. And in general, better collaboration among all the agencies in the U.S. government. That is the strategy that we have with the U.S. administration. It hasn't gotten us very far. What the U.S. administration has done instead is to recently, you've probably heard, designated Haitian gangs as international terrorist organizations. And the problem with that is that that's the same designation they gave to the Venezuelan gang that now has given them excuse to use extrajudiciary expulsions and detentions to remove people. And none of us can support that as a methodology, although we do support any attempts to hold gang members and those who finance gang members accountable. There is some pending legislation, which Pablo will probably talk about. Most of that legislation, and I'm not going to list all the bills, most of that legislation would impact both Mexico and Haiti in terms of arms trafficking. That legislation is not currently bipartisan. So if it's not bipartisan, it won't win. So what that means is that the strategy in the US is to do what we're doing here, really, to do a better job of educating the public about the issue and to make inroads with conservatives, right, especially in Congress, so that the legislation can be bipartisan and would then have a chance of passing. So that is really what the task is now. There's one piece of legislation that directly does impact Haiti. It's called the Haiti Criminal Collusion Transparency Act. And that piece of legislation is bipartisan. And by the way, in the last Congress, Marco Rubio was one of the sponsors. That piece of legislation has a chance of passing, and that would essentially provide additional sanctions to people in the US who are known financiers of the gangs, because they can't buy the weapons unless they have the money. The money is also coming out of Miami. So that's the kind of work that we're doing in the US, both with the administration and legislatively. We also, and Jonathan Lowe isn't on the call, and I know you all have been very involved in the litigation related to Mexico. We are looking into it. We have a coalition of organizations in the United States that have joined together to work on the gun trafficking issue. Jonathan, who's on the call, I think knows a lot more about litigation than I do. But what we understand is that we have to get at least one weapon that's captured from Haiti and killed someone essentially, or was part of a gang action, and trace it to the US, and then we would have the potential for litigation. And we are working on that. Everyone in our coalition has strong partnerships in Haiti, and we're doing what we can to figure out how to develop the evidence that would be needed for litigation. So I talked about the international terrorist designation, and I'll just say one more thing, that, Haiti is dealing with extreme gang violence, extreme sexual violence, extreme hunger, deportees from the US and the Dominican Republic, internally displaced from inside Haiti. It is a catastrophe. And yet we see villages across Haiti engaging in mutual aid to assist all of the victims of these tragedies. And one of the ways that we can, I think, be most supportive of Haiti at this moment in time is to support those mutual aid efforts so that Haiti comes out the other side stronger once we are able to end the violence. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kim.
Pablo, so what could be the strategies that Mexico has used to face the problem that you were telling us before?
El, el tema, Pia, es que durante mucho tiempo, si bien este problema ha estado vigente, había mucho
Well, the
énfasis
thing,
puesto
Pia,
por
is that
México
for a
en
long
eso, en
time,
tratar de
although this problem has
involucrarnos
been
con los llamados
current,
lobbyists en
there
Estados
was
Unidos
a lot
para
of
tratar de
emphasis
cambiar
on
leyes,
Mexico
para
on
tratar de
trying to
impulsar
be
controles más
engaged with the
estrictos,
lobbyists in the US
también asumir
to
la parte de
try to
responsabilidad de
modify
México en nuestros
laws or
propios
to
controles de
try to
aduanas, en
apply more
nuestros propios
stringent
temas de
controls,
corrupción
and also to be
y de
accountable of Mexico in our
administración de
own
justicia y el
controls in
desvío interno.
customs or
Pero
corruption
llegó un momento
issues
donde también
and
esto
this
demuestra que
application
desafortunadamente
of
estos
justice and
impulsos se vuelven muy
internal diversion.
coyunturales, se
But there was
vuelven
a
un
moment in which
impulso
all of this
que
shows
surge
that
cuando hay un
unfortunately
incidente, ya sea de
those are
trasiego o de
situation
incautación
dependent.
mayor,
It is an
cuando se vuelve
impulse
una nota de
when
prensa
it's
muy
a
visible, pero también
an
muy
important
fácilmente,
problem
como
of a
desafortunadamente
seizure or
pasa
where
con
it
los
becomes
propios
a
conflictos en el
visual
plano
news.
internacional. Haití
But
ha sufrido de
as
esto
what
donde
how it
puede
happens with
ser
all of the
primera plana
conflicts
y
and
todo el esfuerzo
international
internacional está puesto ahí y de
landscape,
repente
Haiti has
basta que
suffered
pase
all of these. It
un
may have
temblor en
all of
Bangladesh
the
o
attention
que empiece otra
internationally, and
crisis en
then
otra parte
an
del mundo, nos
earthquake happens
olvidamos
in
de
Bangladesh
Haití
or
y de
another
Europa.
crisis
Pues lo
in
mismo
another part
pasará
of the
con
world,
este
and we
fenómeno a nivel
forget
interno.
about Haiti.
Y el
So
cambio de
that's the
paradigma
same thing
vino
that
cuando se tomó
happened
la
internally.
decisión en
And
la
the change
administración
of
anterior en los
paradigm
años
started when
2021 y
there
luego en
was a
2021 y
decision
2022
taken in
de tener
2021 in
una
the
estrategia
previous
distinta y que
administration and
fuera
in
una
2022
de
of having
litigio
a different
estratégico
strategy
para
and
combatir
to
el
be
trasiego de armas
and
en cortes
strategic
americanas, con
litigation
abogados
to
americanos,
fight
con base en
these
legislación
in
americana
inter-American
en
courts
Estados
based
Unidos.
on the American
Entonces,
legislation
en
in the US.
2021, en agosto de 2021,
So
México
in
presentó la
2021,
primera
in
demanda en una
August,
corte de
Mexico
Boston,
files a
Massachusetts,
first
en contra
complaint
de
in
8
Boston,
empresas
Massachusetts court
fabricantes
against
de
8
armas.
companies, manufacturer
Y
companies
después,
of arms.
el año que le siguió, en octubre de
And
2022, se
then the
presenta una
next year,
segunda
in October
demanda en
2022,
Tucson,
they filed
Arizona,
a
en
second
contra de
complaint in
5
Tucson,
tiendas que venden
Arizona,
armas.
against
El
5
argumento en
stores
ambos litigios
selling
es muy
arms.
similar, es prácticamente el mismo.
The argument in
Tiene que
both
ver con las
litigations is
prácticas
almost the same.
negligentes
It's
de
related
falta
to
de
the
control de
negligent
armamentos, tanto por
practices
los
of a lack
productores
of
como
control
por
of
los
arms
vendedores, que
by
hace que últimamente
manufacturers
estas
and
armas terminen en
sellers,
México
which
causando
makes
daño en la población.
these arms end
Y lo
up
que
in
queríamos
Mexico
demostrar y
causing
queremos
harm to the
demostrar también
population.
es
What we wanted to show
que,
and what we actually want to
lo que hay
show
que
is
regular y lo que hay que observar es el
that what we
ciclo
need to
completo del arma,
regulate
desde
is
que se
the full
produce, se
cycle of arms,
comercializa,
since
se
the
manda a una tienda y se
manufacturing,
vende.
trading,
Todos esos
since it is
pasos tienen
sent
el
to a
mismo nivel
store
de
to be sold.
responsabilidad,
So
porque
all
todas
of
las
those
personas y actores
steps or
involucrados en
elements
esos
have
pasos
the same level of
tienen la misma
responsibility.
capacidad de
They have the
conocimiento
same
de que
capacity,
sus
they have the
armas
same
van
knowledge
a
that those
terminar en
arms
México.
are going to end up
¿Y
in
cómo
Mexico.
sabemos esto?
And
Vuelvo a
how
lo
do we
mismo,
know
porque con
this?
propios informes de la ATF desde
Because
hace
as with
décadas,
the reports
esta ha
from the
sido la
ATF,
demostración
since a
respecto
long
de
time
esos
ago, this has
fabricantes,
been
de esos
what happened in
comercializadores,
terms
de
of those
esas tiendas.
manufacturers, dealers,
Entonces,
and stores.
o sea, uno, no es posible que no sepan
So
que la
it is not
mayoría de sus
possible for
armas o que
them to know
muchas
that
de ellas
most of
van a
their
terminar en
arms
México. Y
are
dos,
going to end
si
up
no
in
lo sabían,
Mexico.
deberían de
And
haberlo
if they
sabido
didn't know,
para
they
estas
should have
alturas del
known,
partido. Llevamos ya mucho tiempo viendo este
because there
fenómeno,
has been a
no es
whole,
nuevo,
we have
y
been
por eso
looking at this
decidimos
for a long time.
que
It
lo que
is not
había
a
que
new
hacer era
thing. And that we
recurrir a las
decided
vías que
is
nos
that we
ofrece el
have to
derecho y presentar
use
demandas
the
allá.
ways of a
En
law
el
and to
caso de la demanda
file
en Boston, a
some demands
principios de
there.
este
In the
año,
case of
el
the
tema sobre
lawsuit
una
in
cuestión de
Boston,
admisibilidad llegó hasta la Suprema
in
Corte
terms
de
of the
Estados Unidos y
admissibility,
tuvimos
just it
nuestra
reached to the
audiencia allá,
Supreme
lo
Court of the
cual ya es un
US.
gran
We
impacto
had our
y de
hearing there,
suyo
and it
es
has
un
an important
caso de
impact.
éxito porque le ha
And
permitido a México por
it has
primera
been a
vez
success case because
exponer
it allowed
argumentos
Mexico for the
sobre
first
este
time to
nexo causal,
expose
sobre
some
esta
arguments in
proximidad de
terms of
daños
uh,
en el
these
máximo tribunal
next
de
in
Estados
this
Unidos,
link in the
que no es
maximum
menor.
court of the US, which is
Y
an
en
important
paralelo,
thing. And at the same time, we have a case in Tucson that is moving on, and now we're starting in a stage in that is known as discovery. What we are producing is a type of evidence that we may submit to the court in Tucson to show the damage that has been caused in Mexico. And at the same time, what Kim mentioned about the legislation, it is part of what is being questioned, is exactly to have a law for the protection of illegal trade of arms, plaque, as it is known in the U.S., which is the one protecting all of the individuals engaged in this trade chain, and that's exactly what we have to pay attention to in terms of the scope of this law. And at the same time, in 2022, November 2022, Mexico submitted a request of the advisory opinion, which is part of this strategy to show from a regional perspective and with a human rights court that this is also a topic related to human rights. It is not only related to trade, and that's exactly what it has been discussed in the ATF, in the ATT. And I remember that when we had these conversations and the principles regulating the ATT, where for a long time we've heard that this is a trade treaty. We have to have experts on trade, the Ministry of the Economy in Mexico, because this is related to the economy and trade. And the argument of all of us, and from all the different countries of our region, is yes, but we're not talking about trading freezers or refrigerators. We're not talking about the trade of shoes. We're talking about the trade of objects that has the potential to kill and to violate human rights. This is about human rights, and not to lose the link of the impact into Mexico now reaches out to the Inter-American Court with two questions. It asks two questions. If the responsibility of private entities that manufacture, distribute, and sells firearms in terms to the violation of the protection to the right of life in terms of the negligence in which they do to develop their commercial activities is going to be jeopardizing the life of individuals with the jurisdiction of the member states of the OAS. And we were also asking if all the efforts that member states have to start to ensure this protection of victims and by private entities that manufacture, distribute, and sell firearms, if it's aligned to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. This advisory opinion, well, we're just waiting it for to be launched in the next month. The court has been saying is that they expect for them to issue their advisory opinion before summer. They were a little bit delayed because the court is now addressing 3 advisory opinions simultaneously. But what we believe is that the decision that is going to be issued or the opinion to be issued is going to be favorable for the interests of Mexico and for this to strengthen the notion of the limits that we have to have in selling firearms to avoid this negligence and to strengthen the notion of the impact that the arms have in our region, and to also strengthen the idea that if we don't do that, we violate human rights. And with this, we hope that we could be useful in the litigation of Mexico, and we expect that in July, the Supreme Court to issue the decision in the case of Boston. We'll have to wait for Tucson. So this means that, the other way around, this doesn't mean that those are the only cases that Mexico can submit. There is an analysis of which other jurisdiction, lawsuits, and other stakeholders that we may file some lawsuits in the future. So we may start building up on all of this opinion, which is this logic behind an strategic litigation. And lastly, as Kim mentioned this, the recent appointment of terrorist organizations. of some groups of the organized crime. So I think that the most important for me is that Mexico doesn't share these classification. It is not that we don't share it in this context. Mexico, due to a position and principle and to follow the international law, systematically has been opposing the unilateral designation of terrorist groups because this is a political and an arbitrary decision. There's no definition of international terrorism. So if there is no classification coming from the Security Council, Mexico rejects this designation and the creation of these unilateral decisions. Now, in this specific case, it's the same thing. Those are designations having a political purpose that are not related to the international law that Mexico doesn't recognize and rejects. However, what I could say is that something that is being analyzed, and if the President Claudia Sheinbaum could give an instruction for this, is that designations, ironically, made the applicable legal framework in the US. And here, let's remember that all of our cases are stated based on American laws submitted to American courts with American lawyers. If that American laws consider certain groups, which are the ones ending up having those arms as terrorists, this means that the legal framework is not only PLACA and the regulation of arms, but now we have all the anti-terrorist law and the concept to those organizations. So there is a possibility of having an expansion of lawsuits from those considerations. Well, that's something that we have been exploring too, but that will depend, as I said, with another decision. We haven't done this yet so far. But what is clear is that Mexico is not going to take a step back in this effort that we had just started, and that is going to convey and entail a lot of time to have an important changes. But what we are paying attention to is in the importance of having a legal framework, the one stating that there is a negligent practice affecting a population beyond the borders of the US.
Muchísimas gracias, Pablo, y creo que la decisión que ha tomado México de poner todos los
Thank you so
esfuerzos
much, Pablo.
en estas
And I think
instancias
that the
judiciales
decision that
es muy
Mexico
importante
made
para
of
otros países
just
en la región, ¿no? Y también
placing all of
lo que ha
these efforts
sucedido
in
en el
these
marco del
legal
Tratado de
instances is
Comercio
an
de
example
Armas,
for the
¿no? Entre
region.
dos
And what has
países
happened
que son
in
Estado
terms of
parte
this
y que hay
arms
unas
trade
decisiones, como
treaty
mencionan ya
framework
ustedes,
for
algunos
all of those
abogados,
countries that
no se
are
han
member states, that
llevado por
some
estar violando el
decisions with some
tratado, por ser
organizations and lawyers made them they made them that they are violating the treaty for certain transfers. I think that that is an important thing that has happened in the case of transfers to Saudi Arabia, in particular with as the stakeholder. So before moving on to the Q&A session, now that we are talking about the arms trade treaty, and now that Pablo, well, you were part in the negotiations as a legal advisor, how important this was for a lot of states, for the civil society, how we promote the topic of transparency, knowing that what you were saying about in the beginning, who is the one selling, who is the one buying, to have this analysis that we could do from the reports of transparency. So I think that this is important to take a couple of minutes to listen from Sol for her to tell us how we're doing in terms of transparency within this arms trade treaty of the ATT. And then we have certain questions. I have 150,000 questions for all of you, for Kim and for Pablo. But meanwhile, let's give the floor to our participants. And before that, let's hear from Sol.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias y muchísimas gracias por también las presentaciones que fueron muy
Thank you
interesantes.
so much, and thank you so much for your presentations, which were very interesting. I'll try to be as brief as possible because I also have a lot of questions, and I would like to hear from you. So I would like to talk about the implementation of the Arms Trade Treaty and the transparency as a way to prevent and mitigate violation of human rights. In ATT Monitor, we are the only mechanism analyzing the compliance of this treaty. And why this treaty is so important? Because this is the first legally binding treaty linking international law, humanitarian international law, human rights with arms transfers. And I would like to talk a report of the High Commissioner of the United Nations talking about the transparency in arms transfer and its importance. So when we talk about transparency, we talk about accessibility to information, and it is a necessary precondition to have an effective monitoring of transfers. That's exactly what Pablo was saying. We need to have access to this information because with this, we're going to be having a better risk assessment. It enables accountability. We can start legal processes with availability and the access to data. And it reduces the risk of diversion. And of course, we have obstacles for transparency. There are obstacles for transparency. Now, here we can see at the base of the pyramid, which is something essential, and then we're going up to having more granularity, which is the lack of this compliance. In this arms trade treaty, we have 28 member states or countries ratifying it last year. In the reports of 2023, only 13 countries did it publicly. So those are these countries of the American region. It is important to clarify that. Number two, once we submit a report and we exclude information due to national security reasons, this is allowed by the treaty. However, when we exclude information, we need to clarify from where we are excluding it. Then, number three, the reliability of the information. When we prepare reports, it is important to clarify the description of the arms and comments to get to know end users. And then some other obstacles to transparency related to the lack of access of information in terms of legal dispositions or some rejected licenses, information related to rejected licenses. States don't make this information publicly. Now, just for you to have a snapshot, let me share what's happening in the Americas. So we have 8 member states who haven't presented and a public report. So we have other 10 member states who have a mixed record. So this means that in some years they made public reports and in some other years they have been submitting private reports. In order to continue to talk about obstacles to transparency in the monitor of the treaty, we understand that there is a report. A report is transparent when it is public, because let's remember that we understand that transparency equals access to information. It is not only within the member states, but also to other organizations, members of a civil society, the general public, for this information to be divided by type of arm, importer, exporter. If we need to mention if there is a need of licenses in real transfer, and we need to state the number or the value of each type of arm. Now, from the information of 2022, only 4 countries fulfill these standards. And in order to have a higher level of transparency, those countries showing where the information is, if it's a class, if they have a breakdown of information, or if they have more information. For 2022, only Canada and Peru provided information showing a highest level of transparency. So this means that they comply with all of the indicators that are mentioned here in the presentation. Now, a fourth obstacle to transparency relates to risk assessment. In a couple of minutes, I'm going to show you how many states for arms and how many states repeat that. But the report of the High Commissioner of the United Nations recommends that we have to provide information in terms of approved licenses, some rejected requests, real exports of arms and users, and the end use of those imports and exports, and to disseminate the criteria of risk assessment and this risk assessment related to international law of human rights and the international humanitarian law. Besides, in the initial reports to the Arms Trade Treaty, it is indicated or it is recommended one of the aspects that we may show is for important states to inform or share information to exporting states for them to carry out their risk assessments. So this is also a recommendation. This is what we see reported. This is not a snapshot. This is not the right snapshot. This is what it has been included in the reports of the Arms Trade Treaty in the last 10 years. What you see on the screen is exactly the image of that. As you can see, the highest arms transfer is in small and light arms. And in the Americas, we have more states reporting that those are importing. We have more imports of arms than exports of arms in the Americas. So those are the reports, the specific reports for the Americas. And well, Maria Pia, that's my presentation. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Muchísimas gracias.
No, muchísimas gracias a vos, Sol. Acá estoy viendo las preguntas.
Thank you so much, Sol. So I'm looking at the questions so we could move on to the Q&A session from our participants. And we have two questions. I don't know if Kim and Pablo, here we have two questions, two general questions, and we have some other specific questions for each one of you, for Kim and for Pablo. So I would like to start with general questions. We have one from Egypt, from Aicha Unit ACMA, which is an organization from Egypt, Mohammed Mokhtar, asking, how can civil society organizations effectively address the threats faced by special rapporteurs when fulfilling their role in tackling issues of responsible arms transfer as exemplified by the scrutiny of irresponsible arms transfer to Israel? So I don't know if Kim or Pablo could share a specific practice. And then we have another question from James Needham from South Sudan. South Sudan cannot buy arms. However, Uganda can. So the question is, South Sudan agreed with Uganda to buy arms and to pass them to South Sudan. How can we deal with this legally? What would be the legal possibilities in order to address this issue? So let's start with those questions and then we move on to the specific questions to each one of you. They are difficult questions. Well, the legal question is not going to be difficult for Pablo. So, Kim or Pablo?
Kim, ¿quieres hacer?
Quizá yo tendré nada más un apunte para hacer sobre esta pregunta y tiene que ver
I
con que
have
en
one thing
realidad
to
el
mention
problema
about
que
these
nos
questions,
enfrentamos
which
y es
is
uno
related to the
recurrente
fact
y
that
también
the
fue
problem
uno
that
que
we
surgió
face, and
cuando
is a
negociamos el
recurrent
ATT,
problem, and
es la
one that
relación que
arises when
guarda
we
con el tema
negotiated
de
the
sanciones del
ATT,
Consejo de
is the
Seguridad y es algo en lo que
relationship
Kim
related
también
with the
seguramente nos va a
sanctions
poder hablar
of a
mucho
Security
más y ya lo
Council. And
menciona un
Kim
poco
probably would
en su
share a little bit
introducción.
more about this,
Y
and
esto siempre
she
es un
mentioned it
dilema
while she was
de qué
introducing
va
the
antes
topic.
o
And
qué es
this is
más
also
importante,
a
porque
dilemma, what comes
desde la mesa
first
del
or what is
Consejo de
more
Seguridad de Nueva
important.
York se ve un conflicto a
Because at the
distancia
table of the Security
y
Council
como
in
en
New York, if
realidad
there
el
is a
único
conflict in a
recurso
distance, and as in the
y
only
pondrían en duda
resource,
si es el más efectivo, pero de los
and I
únicos
would
recursos
question if
más
it's the most
tangibles como
effective resource, but one
mecanismos
of the
que
most
tiene en
tangible
su
resources
toolbox el
as a
Consejo de
mechanism
Seguridad es el
that
establecimiento de
they have in the
sanciones,
toolbox for
que
the
pueden
Security
ser
Council is
sanciones
establishing
económicas, de
sanctions,
libertad de
which
movimiento,
may be
pero
economic
también de
sanctions, the
armamento,
freedom of
pues se enfoca
movement,
en eso,
or as well
pensando
related to
también en esta
arms.
lógica
So
de
they
pues si no
focus on
llegan
that
armas no
and
se
thinking about this
alimenta el
logic:
conflicto.
if that we don't
Pero
reach,
siempre
if
hay
we
una
don't receive
tensión
arms, then we don't feed
de,
the conflict.
bueno,
But
ok,
there's
no
always
entran
a
armas porque hay
tension.
un país
Okay, so
sancionado,
we don't receive
pero
arms
el
because there's
Estado y
we
las
have a
fuerzas del Estado
sanctioned
también cómo pueden
country, but
hacer
the
frente a
state
retos
and
de
the state
seguridad
forces, how can they
interna
face
y sobre
some
todo cuando se enfrentan a
security
actores no
issues, some
estatales que están
security
obteniendo
or
armas
internal
seguramente por
security
mercado ilícito,
challenges, and
cuando el
when they
Estado no puede
face some
obtenerlo de
other
manera lícita
stakeholders,
porque hay un
when they
acuerdo.
have the
Y viene
access,
este dilema
or
de
when
sí,
they
bueno,
have
pero es que
groups
si
with
las
the
obtiene el
access to
Estado se
illegal arms.
desvían porque hay
But yes,
corrupción
but
en el
if
Estado, les
if
faltan
we
controles,
if the
entonces no
state
ayuda.
receives the arms,
Pero
they are going to be
últimamente sí
diverted.
hay una
But
genuina pregunta
lastly, there is a
sobre qué
question
tanto le
which
estamos
is
negando
related
la
to
capacidad a los
how much
estados
are we
para hacer
denying the
frente a los retos de
capacity to
seguridad
states
que
in order
tienen
to
internos.
face their internal security
Y no lo
challenges.
estoy simplificando porque me queda
And I'm
claro
not
que la
simplifying this because it's
complejidad
very
de todo
clear for
esto
me that the
es
complexity of all
mucha.
of this is
Y ese creo que es parte del
huge.
problema, que esa
And
complejidad
that's
a
part of the
veces no
problem, that
necesariamente se traduce en
complexity
resoluciones del
sometimes
Consejo de
is not going to be
Seguridad
well
y
translated into
existe
the
esta
resolutions of the
tensión
Security
constante,
Council. And we
donde
have a
entonces
constant tension
hay un
where
gobierno que sigue
there
viéndose
is one
como un gobierno
government
fallido,
that
como
has
que
been
no
seen
puede
as a
controlar
failed
su
government but
seguridad,
cannot control
pero
its
la gente a veces
security.
pierde de vista
And at
que
the
este
same time,
gobierno
people, they
fallido
lose
no
sight
tiene
that this
acceso a armamento
failed
para
country, they don't
tratar de
have access
mantener su
to arms
seguridad
in
y
order
cómo
to
hace
maintain
frente
their security,
a
and
todo
how
el
to
reto que
face all
implican
of
los
this
actores
challenge
militares.
that
Entonces me parece
entails
que es una
non-statal
cuestión que
actors.
amerita no
So this
revisar
is an
necesariamente el
issue that is not
ATT,
exactly that we need
sino
to check
revisar
the
el sistema y el
ATT, but we
mecanismo de
need to
sanciones, de la
check the
implementación de
mechanism
sanciones y de
of
monitorización
sanctions,
del Consejo de Seguridad,
implementation,
que
and
también es
monitoring of
muy
sanctions
malo
of the
en
Security Council,
retirarlas.
which is not
Normalmente
good
el Consejo de
in
Seguridad una
remove
vez que
them.
impone
Usually,
sanciones
Security
o
Council,
crea
when they
comités de
establish some
sanciones,
sanctions, or they create
se quedan
sanction
ahí durante
committees,
mucho
they
tiempo
stay there for a
y
long
creo que
time.
también hay un problema de hacer
And
una
there is
revisión de
another
los impactos,
problem.
los
We need
efectos
to check
positivos
the
y de
impacts, positive
recalibrar sus
effects,
propias medidas.
and
Pero
just to
esa sería
calibrate the
mi
measures.
reacción
That
inmediata a
would
ese
be my
tema.
immediate response to that question.
Pablo,
Thank you
Kim,
so much. Kim,
¿algún comentario?
do you have something to add?
I can add something about the arms embargo issue, just to say, I mean, my expertise is in Haiti, so I don't want to venture too far from talking about Haiti. But on the arms embargo issue for Haiti in particular, the problem is that if you allow them in legally, then they get diverted. That's what the problem is. And when you're in a situation where there's almost no functioning government, where there's certainly no functioning military, where the Haitian National Police is struggling, although I think many of them are quite heroic. There are also a number of instances where the Haitian National Police has diverted arms over to the gangs. So that's what the difficulty is, and it's a tough balance because no one can argue with strengthening the Haitian National Police as part of the solution. We have to strengthen the Haitian National Police, but in a context of very weak governance and very weak civil society, it's difficult to strengthen the national police when the gangs are significantly more powerful and the temptation to corruption overpowers what the police is able to do. So that's what the issue is, that they get diverted to the gangs. And in fact, it ends up making the gangs stronger in many cases, where we've seen evidence that weapons that were destined to go to the Haitian police actually ended up in the hands of gangs. So I can that's, I think I'll stop there in terms of the arms embargo. In the Haiti context, it makes sense because of the level of corruption and diversion, in my view. I think if we were able to solve the governance issues in Haiti, where you had a functioning government that had some semblance of control over what was going on, that would be a different situation, but that's not what we have. And I would argue that we aren't going to get a functioning democratic government until the security situation is changed at this point. There's no space for democracy in Haiti right now. It can't happen.
Y Pía, perdón, un comentario más sobre el tema, olvidé el tema de la pregunta sobre
Oh,
Israel
something
que
else,
mencionó
Pia. I
tu
forgot
comentario de
the
Egipto.
topic of a
El
question about
comentario que haré
Israel that
tiene dos
it was
aspectos.
asked
El
by a
primero es
colleague from
recordar que
Egypt.
Israel
The comment,
firmó el
my
ATT.
comment is one, let's
No
remember
es
that
parte porque no ha
Israel
ratificado,
signed
pero
the
sí lo firmó,
ATT.
de tal manera que tiene una
It's
obligación de no
not
afectar el
a
objetivo
member state,
del
but they
tratado,
ratified,
y
so they
eso es
have an
algo que
obligation
podría
of
ser analizado por
not
las
affecting
partes del
the
tratado en una
end of
conferencia
a
de Estado
treaty, and
parte del
this may be
ATT. Y
analyzed
también
by the
recordar que ya hubo un intento
state
de
members in
Nicaragua
a
de
conference. And
demandar
let's remember
a
that
un
there was
país,
an
Alemania, ante
attempt
la
from
Corte Internacional
Nicaragua
de Justicia precisamente por sus transferencias de armas a Israel
suing
y el
a
vínculo que
country
esto
due to
tiene con lo que
the
está
armed
sucediendo
transfers
en Gaza.
to
Entonces me
Israel and
parece
what is happening in
que sí
Gaza.
hay una base
So it seems to
de
me that there
análisis, por
is
lo
a
menos dentro de los estados
foundation
parte del
of
ATT, sobre qué
analysis,
tanto lo
at
que está
least
pasando
amongst the member states
viola
of
el
the
objeto
ATT
y
of what
fin
is
del
happening. It
tratado
violates the
del
object
comercio de
and the
armas.
purpose of a treaty of the
Muchas
Arms Trade
gracias,
Treaty.
Pablo. Bueno, vuelvo a Kim para
Okay,
una
thank you so
próxima
much,
pregunta
Pablo.
que era
Let me
sobre
go back
Colby,
to Kim for a
que
next
también lo
question,
conocemos desde
which
la
is
época
asked by Colby.
de las
We all know
negociaciones.
him since the time of a
Dice que vos hablaste
negotiation.
sobre el tema de
And
el rol
Kim,
que
you mentioned
cumple la
that
corrupción en
corruption
el
is
tráfico
playing
de
a
armas
role
en
in the
Haití y
trafficking of
pide si
weapons in
podés
Haiti.
dar como algunos
Could
ejemplos
you provide
específicos
some more
del tipo
specific
de
examples
corrupción y
on
cuáles
the
son
types of
las entidades que
corruption
están
and the
utilizando la
entities
corrupción para
using this
traficar
corruption to
ilícitamente armas
illicitly
a Haití?
transfer arms to Haiti?
So we can see corruption basically on all sides in this situation. And I mentioned the Haiti Criminal Collusion Transparency Act as one of the solutions. The reason for that is because of the corruption that's taking place inside of the United States, where people are financing gangs illegally. So that's really the starting point of the corruption, right? It starts in the US where people are illicitly financing the purchase of weapons. But there's corruption at Miami River. In other words, why do these boat captains not know what's on their ship? You know, they say they don't, but they are actually supposed to know. So somebody's paying somebody. And then we can say there's corruption at the ports in Haiti as well. So they're coming in primarily by boat. They're allowing them in. So the Haitian police and border officials are also turning the other way and letting things into the country. The same is true at the border with the Dominican Republic. So it's Haitian border officials, but it's also border officials in the Dominican Republic that are allowing things to come through. And likely also in other countries in the Caribbean, although I can't speak as directly to that. So, and I mentioned it earlier, corruption in some areas of the Haitian government and police where they're allowing weapons to be diverted into the hands of gangs for cash. I mean, in the current government, although it continues to seem to have the support of the United States, the current government has also been accused of corruption in a variety of different ways.
Muchas gracias, Kim. Hay un par de preguntas para Pablo. Te las hago las preguntas juntas, si te parece.
Thank you very
bien.
much, Kim.
Una es
There
de
are a
Sara,
couple of questions for
de
Pablo.
México,
I'll
nuestra amiga Sara
pose
San
them
Martín.
all
Y ella
together,
pregunta,
if that's all
¿qué se
right. One is from
podría,
Sarah
cómo puede el TCA
from
colaborar
Mexico, our friend Sara San Martin
con
from
el
Mexico.
desvío,
She asks,
pero al interior de nuestro
how
país,
can
¿no?
the
Porque
ATT help with diversions that are happening inside of Mexico. Could you explain a bit about this topic so that we can understand it better? And then there's another question about the strategies, the legislative strategies focusing on the United States, and that's from Brenda Anguiano. The question is, what would be the next step in the case that there's a favorable result, for instance, sanctions against stores in Arizona? I'll start with the second question, which is easier to answer. The next step is to continue the process, the litigation processes. Wait for the decision from the Inter-American Court and see how that could be used for arguments in the other cases. Also advance the discovery process in Arizona. That's going well. There are a lot of prospects there. And we also have to wait and see what the decision is in the court decision for the Boston case. In the Boston case, a lot of times there are decisions that aren't so severe or cut and dry. It's a very different legal system over there than what we have in Mexico, the civil system. But it allows for a lot of precedent to be set. And so despite of the final decision, there are important things that can come out of the decisions. So we have to wait and see what the courts say, see what we can rescue from that. We can also think about how we can use that to figure out how we can improve the other cases, how to mend problems, and also see if there are new cases and see how we can use these previous arguments to advance the new cases in other states. But as simplistic as that may seem, that response, we need to wait for those decisions. We have to understand the terms that they come in and then advance in the different litigation processes, move through those steps. And also be thinking about what other cases we have out there for the future to move forward in the future. So we're looking at a longer term, nothing short term. As far as the ATT and how it can help with the diversion issue, as we've mentioned, the ATT is very explicit and it excludes internal sales. It doesn't regulate those. And so based on what Sol was saying, talking about transparency, something that the ATT doesn't help with here in the case of the United States, the ATT is looking for transparency in international sales. But when we want transparency to figure out what's been sold internally in the United States to then determine what of those weapons ended up in the United States through small-scale sales, small-scale purchases, well, it doesn't matter if there's good relationships between the authorities in the United States and Mexico, or it doesn't depend on the general or the prosecutors' offices and their queries. It doesn't matter because it's still not that easy to use the ATT as grounds to get information about how weapons are diverted internally. And also, I'll return to the previous thing I mentioned, the United States, and even with the binational relationship, the United States is no longer interested in supporting the ATT, so they're not necessarily going to cooperate with these issues. Where I do think we can make an impact with the ATT, and it was designed for this, well, if we know the amount of weapons that country A sold to country B, and then we see that the number of weapons that entered country B is not in the hands of the official authorities for whom they were destined. It's not in the hands of the army, the military, or the police, or whatever, the intended destinataries. well, then there you have a situation where you can start to look into the diversion question. If the legal sales aren't in the hands of those who should have them, well, we have a diversion problem. So you could ask, did the entire volume reach the destinaries? Yes, okay, we're good. But if it didn't, then we need to look into the supply chain. So that entails looking at the ports, at the shipping and packing. Because a lot of times we often think about diversion as a result of corruption, which happens internally. But a lot of times it happens in a third country where there's a port, there was a container that was taken out and never even reached the destination country. And that's where the ATT can be helpful. But undoubtedly, it gets much more complicated when you're trying to measure the amount of sales and the diversions internally inside of a country, particularly in the United States. And so that's a definite challenge, and it will continue to be one. Thank you, Pablo. We still have a few more minutes. I think we have some questions that we can take at the end. It has to do with collaboration and how to strategically use the ATT. But I'm going to take advantage of my role as the facilitator to make my own question. This one is for Kim and one for Pablo. Kim, it's not the first time that there's a United Nations mission in Haiti. And it seems to me like this is the worst moment. It always seems to be the worst moment, and then it gets worse. And you've been working since the 90s. What has changed in the last 20 years? And what still needs to be done beyond the obvious things? What's made it that Haiti finds itself in this current situation? And do you think that this decision to send Kenyan police or Kenyan military there, do you think that's a good decision? Keeping in mind some of the things that we know about the Kenyan police.
Yeah, so as I understood the question, basically what happened that got us to this point, and it's the first thing to say is that it's complicated. But the second thing I can say is that, there's this, things have been deteriorating for a long time, but what put us to the point where we are now was the assassination of the president a few years ago by Colombian mercenaries, and there's been a whole long investigation of that, which I will not go into. It put the country into a worse governance crisis than it already was. And what happened was, instead of supporting a civil society process within Haiti to solve the governance problem, the United States and its other country sidekicks that control most of what happens in Haiti put its own process into place and supported a government that was considered to be completely illegitimate. And the gangs gained significant power as a result of the fact that the government of Haiti was considered illegitimate by the people, was not elected. There was no civil society process to get us to that point. It was imposed by the outside. And so the criminal gangs then rose to power in that context and gained more power than they would have had there been a legitimate government in place. And that situation continues. So finally, despite much pressure, by the way, from those of us in the US who work on these issues, who spoke directly to US government officials and said, you're supporting the wrong people. right? Despite all of that pressure, the US government didn't back down until essentially it was too late. And they had a crisis on their hands, and they had to replace that government with a different government that was also mostly imposed and mostly was not considered legitimate by the people of Haiti. And that is where we are right now. We're in a quote unquote transitional government that the people of Haiti consider to be illegitimate, that have been accused of corruption, and there's significant evidence to show that. And so the government itself doesn't have support among the people that it needs to have support in order to govern. And that's when you have a vacuum like that, is when criminal gangs can take over. And that's how we got to the point where we are now. So it's the US government essentially making the wrong decision about about who to support in Haiti, and not providing the space for civil society in Haiti to come up with their own solutions, which civil society in Haiti is very capable of doing.
Muchas gracias, Kim. Pablo, vos habías
Thank you
hablado
very
en
much,
tu
Kim.
exposición
Pablo,
acerca
you've spoken
del
in
tema
your
de ganar la
remarks
narrativa, ¿no? Ganar la
about
narrativa,
winning the narrative,
ganar el entendimiento de la gente,
controlling the narrative,
pero se sabe
getting
que hay
the
una
general
relación muy fuerte,
population's
están muy aferrados los
understanding.
americanos a la segunda enmienda, ¿no?
But we
Son
also
fanáticos
understand
del,
that the United
del
States
valor, de la
population
democracia, de la
closely, dearly
libertad,
values their Second
del
Amendment and these
patriotismo, de la
topics related to
masculinidad, ¿no?
patriotism
Hay una
and
asociación
liberty
común
and
entre esos.
masculinity. There's a
¿Vos
strong
crees que con el
association
tema de
between
los
those
litigios es
concepts.
suficiente
Do you
para
think that the
poder
litigation
ganar
will be enough
esta
in order
narrativa?
to be able to win over or
Es
control the
suficiente,
narrative?
definitivamente no. Es tan profundo y está tan arraigada esta visión de
I
casi
think that the answer is
un
definitely
pasión
no.
hacia las armas,
The
que cualquier estrategia tiene que ser
the
una
United States'
estrategia con
passion
muchos ejes
for
y con muchos
weapons goes so
componentes.
deep and is so strong,
Me parece que no hay
and
una sola
that means
fórmula
that
que
the
lo resuelva todo.
strategy has to
Donde sí
have a
creo que
lot
hay una
of different
ventaja es
axes and a lot
que
of
los
elements to it. I don't think
lo
there's
que
one
han generado es
formula
abrir
or one
espacios,
solution that's going to resolve
sobre todo en
everything.
medios de
Where we do
comunicación,
have an advantage is that
más
the litigation
artículos,
has opened up new
tanto
spaces,
editoriales, de
particularly in the
opinión, de
media.
prensa, desde
There's
que
been more
Reforma lo
articles
está pasando
published,
hasta que hacen un análisis de
editorials,
estos casos,
op-eds,
y eso permite entonces por lo menos
articles
poner
that
al
represent
alcance
what's
otro tipo de
happening and even
perspectiva.
analyze
Hubo una
the
cápsula
situations.
de 60
And
minutos
so
que
that
fue
at
uno de los
least
programas
brings a
el
different
programa más
narrative
visto
to
en
different
Estados
audiences.
Unidos, que habla sobre los
60
litigios en
Minutes, which
México.
is a very
Y esto no
well-known
es
show,
menor,
if
y
not the
creo que
most prominent news
no
show,
solamente los
had a
espacios que hemos
capsule on this
abierto
or focused
en
on
mi
this
país,
issue.
sino allá, poco a poco nos deja sembrar
And so there's new
siguiendo
spaces
por lo menos
in
estas dudas
Mexico,
para que la
but
gente cuestione y
also
pondere las cosas de
in
manera
the
diferente. Y
United
por eso cada
States.
vez que podemos y que hablamos de esto,
It's
somos
going to
muy
allow people
enfáticos en
to
tratar de
question
hablarle a la
things, to
gente y
look at it, things
decirle,
from a
el que
different
sufre es el pueblo de
perspective.
México, y el pueblo de
Anytime
México
that
le está
we
hablando
bring
al
up
pueblo de
this
Estados Unidos
issue,
para
we
decir,
are
yo no
really
me quiero
focused
afectar tus
on getting that
derechos de
message
la misma
across, to
manera que no
talk
quiero que tú
directly
afectes los
to the
míos.
American public, letting
Porque
them
si
know
en
the
México
Mexican
tenemos un
population is
control de armas
suffering
que
from
hace
this, and
que no cualquiera pueda
if it's
comprar
the case that in
una
Mexico
pistola en
we
cualquier
have
tienda, en
regulations
cualquier
preventing
supermercado.
just anyone
Pues
from
entonces,
buying a
¿por qué
gun
tú, ciudadano,
at
estás
whatever
pensando que
store or
tus
any
derechos no están en
supermarket,
peligro?
then why is it
El
that
daño,
you
el
as
daño lo
a
estamos sintiendo
citizen,
todos.
why are you allowing for
Y
your
mencionaste un
rights
aspecto
to
que
impact
también para
mine?
nosotros es fundamental,
I'm
es
experiencing the harms
masculinidades.
of
Creo
your
que esto
rights.
abre
The
toda
other
una
thing that's
beta
important for us
mucho
is
más
the issue
profunda
of
a la que
masculinity.
queremos
I think
que
here this goes
poder
much
afrontar,
deeper,
de cómo
and
sí esto
we
tiene un
have to
impacto
engage
sobre una
this
visión
issue directly.
patriarcal del Estado y de las
The
armas,
question of
y
how
cómo
this is
las
connected
armas, el
to a
uso de la fuerza y la
patriarchal
violencia como tal están
structure
asociadas
of the
con la
state and
masculinidad y las
how weapons and
masculinidades.
violence are
Creo que
associated
gran
with
parte de
masculinity and
y de esa
masculinities.
pasión por la posesión
And
de
I
armas
think
está ligada con
a
la
strong
sensación de
element
muchos de que
here,
eso es lo
this
que te hace
passion
ser
for the
hombre, y ser un
weapons,
hombre
has to do
masculino,
with
fuerte,
people's notions that
poderoso.
that's what makes you a
Aquí en
man, it makes
México,
you
la
strong and
presidenta Claudia
powerful.
Sheinbaum
And
anunció
here in
hace
Mexico,
unos
President Claudia
meses, yo
Sheinbaum
creo ya,
recently
un programa que se
announced
llama
a few
Hacia el
months back, I
Hacia la
believe,
Paz,
she introduced a program called Yes to Disarmament, Yes to Peace. And I love it specifically because it created centers or locations where people can go and hand over their weapon, decommission their weapons. They're going to receive a small sum, they're going to receive some benefits, and it allows people to disarm, to disarm. But the other part of this initiative that I really love is that these locations, there's a second component to it, and children can go there and also hand over toys that are weapons or toy guns, and then choose a different kind of toy to replace the toy gun. And so this is what I'm talking about. We're really concerned about the Iron River, the flow of weapons, and we need to think about initiatives that are educational or educative and are going to have an impact on children that allows them to understand that they don't have to play with guns in order to be boys, in order to grow up to be men. And I think impacting this general awareness of children, when we focus on that, we understand how we've been normalizing something that is not good. The idea that you can play and kill someone as a game, that's something that we need to change. That's part of the narrative that we need to impact. And I think the more that we can impact in these areas and transform these narratives, the more positive transformations we're going to see. I think in general, we're talking about strategies that are not for the short term. They're not going to be one, they're only going to be one in the long term. And I think it's in the long term where we're going to see the major results. But we do want to have a cultural change internally in our countries, but also in other countries. And we need to start somewhere. And the time to start is now. So it's not going to be easy. We have to assess, take stock of our tools and see if they're going to be enough. And if they're not, then we have to do analysis and see what else we can do is to move forward.
Muchísimas gracias, Pablo. Bueno, ya estamos en el final.
Thank you very much, Pablo. We're moving towards the end of the program. I'm going to ask Sol to make some final remarks. There's also a question about how we can come together to advance the objectives of the ATT. And so I'll ask you for a final reflection in under a minute. I'm also going to share some information in the chat from Gamboa. And so I'm talking to Pablo, Sol, and Kim, and I'll ask for 1 minute reflections from each of you. First, I'd like to thank Pablo and Pia for the space. I think that thinking about transparency, the more we can report, the more that we can share descriptions, the more detailed that we can make the report, then the better. That's going to help with transparency. And for those countries that did not report in previous years, I think it's important to say that it's never too late to report. I think transparency in the reports for the ATT are really important. Kim or Pablo, would you like to say anything else? Kim, a final reflection from you? No? Pablo, any last remarks? Once again, I just wanted to thank you for the space. I think it's important to continue these discussions. The challenges are going to persist. The conflicts in terms of the relationship between Mexico and the United States, we're going to see more things develop. We can't sit back and relax. We have to keep vigilant.
O sea, me da un poco la impresión,
I have the impression, and perhaps I'm wrong, that there was a lot of efforts put forth to make the ATT move forward and to have it be approved. Initially, people thought that it wouldn't be approved. And then when we achieved that, there was this kind of fatigue that set in. I lived through that. It was as if like we've already won this and we can relax now. And so people start to lose sight of things and focus on different things. And I think sometimes it's important to take up once again these matters and understand that getting the ATT approved was just the first part of a broader process that still hasn't come to fruition, and that it's a continuous labor that's involved here, that pressure has to be sustained, and that the work of civil society and their participation is fundamental here, because there are organizations that are monitoring this constantly, and they help the states to snap out of it and get focused again. And I think the state of things globally also demands that we focus on this once again, the regulation of weapons, particularly when, as unfortunately we're experiencing now, the geopolitical situation is one where there's more and more military spending. We see that in Europe. It's taking more centrality in Europe, and it's taken away funding from development and the 2030 agenda, issues like climate change and similar other issues. And so it needs to continue to be a major focus in Mexico and elsewhere. I think we need to come together again and rebuild the collateral relations to move this forward as it should be.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Pablo. Y sí, coincido, es un instrumento en la ATT, es mi instrumento favorito, que tiene muchísimo potencial.
Thank you very much, Pablo, and I definitely agree. The ATT is an instrument. It's my favorite instrument. It has a lot of potential. It's been 10 years. Last year it was 10 years that it's been in effect. And I think we need to revitalize our focus, and we can continue to discuss it. There's debates happening now that are substantive, that are focused on preventing irresponsible sales and irresponsible flows. So thank you very much. There's also an event of weapon flows to Haiti on the 24th. Did you want to comment about that, Kim? And we could wrap up with that, because as Pablo was saying, our interest needs to stay up, and we need to continue to stay involved.
Yes, thank you. I did have a slide I was going to put up, but I think it's easier for me to just describe that we're also hosting a webinar specifically focused on the issue of illegal arms and ammunition trafficking to Haiti. It's on Thursday, the 24th. It's at 1 p.m. I think the link is in the chat. And we will feature Bill O'Neill, who's the UN human rights expert on Haiti, who will talk about the human rights issues, and John Lindsay Poland, who will talk about specific measures in the United States related to arms trafficking that people can help with, including the connection between some of the things that we've talked about today that are happening in Mexico. And we'll also talk a little bit more in detail about the impact on women and girls in Haiti, because it's been so horrific. So, as I said earlier in my comments, really getting the word out and helping people around the region, not just in the United States, but in all of the countries represented here, is the most important next step, I think, for us in turning this issue around.
Muchísimas gracias, Kim. Bueno, buenas tardes, buenas tardecitas, buenas noches, buenos días, de acuerdo a donde estén. Y muchísimas gracias a todos por haber participado, especialmente a Control Arms, a Jeff del Forum on Stream, Kim y Pablo. Muchas gracias, buenas tardes.